Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Congray's Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be asking the question of what if the Louisiana Purchase never happened? So just for a bit of a historical context, yeah. So in 1803, President Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana territory from the French, right, under Napoleon. And this greatly expanded the territory of the United States and was part of its manifest destiny. So, you know, the idea of America being a continental empire stretching from sea to shining sea, as the song goes. However, this almost didn't end up happening in our own timeline. So we're going to imagine what would have happened if it had gone differently. So the Louisiana Territory had once been a part of New France, so you know, with the base out in New Orleans, stretching all the way into French Canada. However, after the 7 Years' War, France was kicked out of Canada and that became a British territory, and the French were in a position where they had to sell the rest of the territory to the Spanish, yeah, so it became part of New Spain, as it were. But then with the Napoleonic Wars, yeah, you end up having a situation where France end up taking dominion over Spain, and so they basically strong-armed the Spanish into giving back that territory to the French. And this is part of Napoleon's ambitions to have a North American empire, as there had once been before. However, Napoleon was stumped by this by a revolution which took place in the most valuable French colony, which was Saint Domingue, which later became Haiti. So this is a slave rebellion led by Toussaint Louverture. I see, I'm still really bad at pronouncing French names, yeah. Yeah, so he ended up overthrowing the French, you know, ended slavery, although at a later point he did try and reinstitute it again, but that's neither here nor there. But the point being that France ended up losing its most valuable territory in America, and so Napoleon's ambitions for this North American empire was greatly stunted. And so France was strapped for cash and needed the resources to, you know, fight the European wars, which became later known as the Napoleonic Wars. You know, so like they needed all the money that they could get. On the flip side, America wanted to expand, and so Thomas Jefferson offered $15 million for the purchase of that territory, and in 1803 this ended up going through. However, something to note is that this policy, which on the face of it would have been, you know, greatly popular, yeah, like to our eyes now, it would benefit of hindsight, we were like, that was really smart move, that was big brain move. But at the time, based with the politics of early America, this was a very contentious move. And the reason for that is because the Federalist Party, which was the party mainly centred in the northeast of the country, was very much closely tied to Britain, yeah. Although America had got its independence, they wanted to retain a good trade and like good relationships with the British Empire, and they were very hostile to the French. And on top of that, Thomas Jefferson was from the opposing party, which was the Democratic Republican Party. And this was a party which had emphasised, you know, states' rights, having a reduced federal government, having limited powers of the president. And then he went and exceeded these powers by doing this purchase, right? And so both within the Federalist Party and within his own party, there was a lot of contention about him like doing this because it kind of was hypocritical. It kind of contradicted everything which he had professed to believe in, you know, just for sheer like territorial expansion. And so in Congress, it passed by just 59 votes to 57, right? So if just 2 congressmen had gone the other way on this issue, then it would never have happened. And so this alternative history is going to look at 3 different scenarios of what could have happened if the purchase never went through. The first being that France holds on to the territory. The second being that the territory is eventually handed back to the Spanish. And the third being that the British end up taking over the territory. So that's what we're going to look into in this video. So with these alternative histories, as we do with all of our ones, we have to have the massive caveat, which is that this would never have happened. And the reason it would never have happened is because obviously America is huge, right? Its population is huge. And the idea that this fledgling republic here would have been restricted from having its manifest destiny, yeah, this would never have happened. In the long run, even if it took many decades or centuries for it to happen, eventually America was going to realise its ambitions and was going to kick out whatever force was in the way of this. And so for these scenarios to work, we have to basically imagine America without a manifest destiny. We have to imagine them being happy with just holding the territory east of the Mississippi River. So as unlikely as that is, that's what we're going to kind of run with here. So the first scenario in which the French hold on to it, it would have been interesting, but you know, they would have been very overstretched, you know, especially when like fighting like all these wars on the continent of Europe. Would they have been able to have like effectively held on to this territory? Probably not. Within our own timeline, New France was very, very lightly settled and like didn't have much kind of like French migrants moving there. So you know, outside of major cities like New Orleans and a few other places along the Mississippi River, it wouldn't have been very heavily populated. And so I think that, you know, France, if they'd held on to this, eventually, sooner or later, they would have end up losing the territory. The second scenario is if Spain end up taking it out. So this is talking about after the Napoleonic Wars, when like Spain end up like kind of like having its sovereignty back. The Spanish Empire would have probably taken that territory off of the French again. However, a few years later, Mexico ended up getting its independence, as well as most of the other Spanish territories within the New World. So this territory would have gone very quickly from being a Spanish colony to being part of Mexico. So Mexico in this timeline would have been absolutely huge, yeah, like kind of stretching all the way from its current borders all the way up into like what we think of as like the Western United States now. However, this territory within our own timeline was very, very sparsely populated, you know, and so although Spain claimed this territory, in reality it controlled very little of it. And so with the pressure of this added population, I think that America, just as happened in our own timeline with the states of Texas and California, eventually more and more white settlers would have gone to these territories, and eventually, you know, republics would have been set up, and then eventually those republics would have end up joining America. And so yeah, the Mexican-American War and in our own timeline end up being a complete disaster for Mexico and end up losing a huge swath of their territory. And realistically, I foresee something very similar to this happening. And then the third scenario is probably the more unlikely one, but I think it would have been much more difficult for America to have overcome. And that is one in which the British end up taking over the territory. So the British obviously were already in Canada, and so they had the capability, if they wanted to have settled large swaths of this territory, as they eventually end up doing for Canada. Now, in the War of 1812, you know, between the British in Canada and the United States, it ended up being a draw because, you know, the United States was not able to conquer Canada, as had been their stated goal, and British Canada wasn't able to take over the United States, although they obviously did end up occupying Washington DC and burning the White House to the ground. So yeah, like, but even then they weren't able to hold down the territory. However, American history would be very, very different if the British surrounded them not just from the north, but also from the west as well. So you had the Royal Navy controlling the Atlantic, you would have had the British in Canada, and you also would have had the British in the western states as well. So this would have really threatened like the new republic's like kind of sense of itself. You know, the very nation which it had got its independence from had now basically surrounded it, yeah, on nearly all sides. Especially when you think about obviously the Caribbean as well from the south. So the new American Republic would have basically felt under siege, right? And it's not to say that eventually they couldn't have like pushed the British out of here like over time, but it would have been very, very different from our own timeline. It would have been a lot harder. They also obviously run the risk of losing another war like that of 1812, and so America's population would be basically stuck within like the East Coast. Now, even to the present day, you know, a large swathe of America's population and its economy is still within these eastern states. So 58% of the United States population is east of the Mississippi River. And obviously you think about major cities such as Chicago, such as New York, such as Washington, DC, Philadelphia, etc., etc. You know, a big part of America is like within the eastern part of it. However, the Louisiana Purchase would not have allowed states like, well, obviously Louisiana, so you wouldn't have had New Orleans. Also, states such as Texas and California, which are economic powerhouses, they wouldn't have been part of the new republic. And so America's population and its economic might would have been a lot like less than it was in our timeline. You know, it's not to say that America couldn't have been a huge like economy, because obviously even without those Western states, America's economy would still be huge, but it would never have got to the level of being a superpower as it was within our own timeline, because its economy in the West, especially with like oil from Texas and etc., having access to the Pacific Ocean and being able to like stretch its influence into there as well. This is what helps cement America as being a global hegemon. So with it just being restricted just to the East Coast, like its influence and its power projection would have been very limited. Also, something to note as well is that the American Civil War probably wouldn't have happened in this timeline. And the reason for that is that a big part of what caused the Civil War was the expansion of the states westward, right? So the big debate was about like the expansion of slavery. It wasn't about slavery itself. And so with each new like slave state, you needed to have an extra free state being established in the north, right? This is the reason why the state of Maine was created, and this is also why the state of Texas, which people had really planned for it to be split into 5 different states because of just how huge it was. This is why Texas is just one state, because if each state in the union gets 2 senators, well then the more states that like the slave owning parts end up having means the more influence they would have like on the rest of the country. And so with America being restricted just to the east of the Mississippi River, you wouldn't have had this expansion of slavery. And so while slavery would have continued a lot like longer into this timeline, I don't think that there would have been the same impetus for a civil war. I think gradually, bit by bit, the southern states probably would have ended slavery, mainly because of pressure from Britain, because they were the southern states' like main trading partner for like the cheap cotton. But obviously Britain in the late 19th century became very, very strongly against slavery. So I think eventually pressure from the British would have basically meant that the South would have copied what Brazil ended up doing when they ended up abolishing slavery in 1888. And so somewhere around that timeline, I think that the southern states would have ended slavery as well. And also something to note as well is the issue of immigration. So immigration within America, a large reason why so many people came from Europe was because of the promise of like extra land out west, right? And so again, if you had this very kind of limited country, although obviously the country like is relatively huge, there would have been less pull, there would have been less reason for people to come there, because the allure of the West, like the mythology of like the cowboy and like the Wild West in general, it's a huge like pivotal part of American psyche. If you think about westerns, you think about like the whole like mythology of like America, of like like the Lone Ranger kind of going out into the wilderness and kind of exploring things and taking out a bit of territory himself. That would have all not happened. Like America, it would just be very, very different. America would see itself very differently. American culture, American history, American society, American politics would be unrecognizable. And so while America would still be a very powerful country in the world, I don't think it would be anywhere near as powerful as it ended up being. And that's something to really bear in mind. So if you like that video, definitely hit the like button, share with your friends, remember sharing is caring, and obviously subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to also watch a great deal more of our other videos. The next video is going to be on what if the South won the Civil War. So we're not going to be focusing so much on the actual war itself. We're going to be looking at Southern society, and we're going to be looking at like how like its governance was, how its constitution was, the different percentage of each state's population which owned slaves and had slaves, etc. And so that's what we're going to look into the next video. So definitely stay tuned for that, and in the meantime, have a great day and bye.